Okay, so as I've just told you that the topic for today's session is behavioral aspects of organizational behavior. So before we just, jump into this topic, let us use the what, why, how technique to understand that what is this topic all about? Why are we talking about this topic and how we are going to talk about this topic? So first thing, what is it that we need to know? What are we going to learn in this session? What are we going to discuss in this session? What is this session going to be about? Right? So the topic seems to be very broad. Behavioral aspects of organizational behavior, it seems to be broad, it seems to be open ended. Whose behavior are we going to talk about here? Is it the behavior of the groups in the organization? Is it about the behavior of the managers in the organization? Is it about the interactions within an organization or interactions of one organization with another organization? So the first thing is, what are we going to talk about? And I need your responses to it. I really need this active participation, because this entire session is going to be about you. I've although dropped a hint here. So what do you think? What does this topic suggest you? Whose behavior are we going to talk about here?
Individual behavior, group behavior with our colleagues in the staff room, with our seniors and higher authority, and at the same time, behavior towards the customers or the clients, outside the organization for branding our own institute.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Priya. So you just hit the nail at the right spot with the very first word. You started with individual behavior, and then we moved on to behavior with their managers, within the organization, with other people, with their customers. So what we are going to do in this session is we are going to, I'm ready to share screen. Yes, go ahead, Ishika. You can share the screen. And I'll let you know when you need to move on to the next slide. So you can just share the screen and keep the first slide open. Right. So in the last 4 days, we have been talking about a lot about organizational behavior. We have been talking about the definitions. We have been talking about the theory building, leadership, entrepreneurship, the research in organizational behavior, the learnings that we can get from Upanishads, power, politics. We have built upon multiple things over the past few days. But today, in this session, we are going to take one step back. Just a moment. I lost my chat once again. Yeah, so we are going to take one step back and talk about the behavior at the individual level. And why is it that? This session is going to be, let me tell you that this session is going to be about the individual behavior, which means your behavior, it means my behavior, it means the behavior of any individual who works in an organizational setting or who works in groups or interacts with other people in any manner. So this session is going to be about individual behavior. But why individual behavior? When we have built upon so many things, why are we taking multiple steps back and going back to the individual behavior? Why do you think it's important to understand the individual behavior?
May I, ma'am?
Yes, sure, doctor.
Maybe sometimes we overreact because external environment might keep changing, but our reaction based on the situation, it is very much individualistic. Like maybe when I know that someone from the higher authority is rude, so my individual behavior, just depending on his designation and position, I might behave in a different way. But at the same time, if a colleague on the same level is trying to be rude, I'll just say that, please talk properly. I might not do that with someone from the higher authority. So it is, I think that is why, maybe.
So our behavior varies in different situations depending upon who is that person we are interacting with, right? So this is one reason to understand and study individual behavior. But I'll come back to the broader part, that this FDP is about organizational behavior. Then why are we studying individual behavior? I'll just reframe the question. And I would really like if all other participants could also participate. I'll repeat my question and reframe my question. This FDP is about organizational behavior. Then why are we studying? Why are we looking at individual behavior? Why do we have an entire session dedicated to individual behavior?
Ma'am, I would like to say I'm Dr. Goswami, Dr. Smita Goswami. We are studying individual behavior because individual make up an organization. So until and unless we understand the individual's behavior, we will not be able to understand the organization's behavior properly.
Perfect, perfect. We have been discussing this from the very beginning. Yes, Dr. Indrani, thank you so much. And Dr. Goswami, thank you so much. So, yes, organizational behavior is actually the study of human behavior in the organizational settings. Organizations are made up of individuals, right? So, therefore, it is important for us to start from the individual level to study. uh, truly, Dr. Sonika, individual behavior are the building blocks of organizational behaviors. These are the foundations. It is the people who build up the company. Totally perfect, Dr. Ajay. So that is why it is important for us to look at individuals, their behaviors, because their behavior is going to have an impact on their interactions. It's going to have an impact on their communications, perceptions, their ego, their thought process, their judgments, their decision making. It's going to have an impact ultimately on the organizational behavior. Thank you so much, Dr. Vishali. Individual plus behavior is equal to organization. Individuals come together, they interact, they communicate, they behave, they judge each other, and then it ultimately leads to a broader thing that we call individual behavior. Thank you so much. So this covers what this topic, what this session is all about, why this session is a part of this FDP, and the last question, the third part: how are we going to study individual behavior? How are we going to go about this session? So human behavior or individual behavior is a very vast field in itself, right? It is not actually possible to cover it in just two. In a 2 hour lecture, but we are going to pick up some terms from psychology. Okay, because the psychology talks a lot, psychology as a field, as a discipline, talks a lot about human behavior. So we are going to pick up some concepts and some terms from psychology which affect the human judgment and behavior, and we're going to link them with the organizational settings. We're going to link them together so that you can get a sneak peek and an idea into what all goes behind a human mind and human behavior, which ultimately impacts the organizational behavior. But let me tell you once again, which I said in the beginning, human behavior is a very vast field, right? No matter how much we try, no matter how much in depth, how much discussion I take place on this topic, or how long a discussion this goes, it's not going to be possible for us to discuss every aspect. That's why we are just going to pick a few concepts of psychology, a few concepts of organizational setting, bring them together so that you get an idea, just an idea and a sneak peek into how and in what ways an individual behavior has an impact on the organizational behavior. So again, this entire session is requires an active participation from your end, because you will find that multiple things that you face in your daily lives is a part of this session, and a lot of things are going to be relatable for you as well, not from the point of view of OB, but in general, in marketing, in finance, because psychology as a discipline extends and substantiates other disciplines as well. So, to begin with, I'm going to introduce a term to you, which is going to form the base of our subsequent discussions. Please listen to this term very carefully. The term is cognitive bias. I'm going to write it down in the chat box so that you all are aware of this term that I'm going to talk about. Cognitive bias. Anyone has heard of this term before? It's made up of two words, cognitive and bias, and I'm going to discuss this. But any one of you has heard of this? You can just raise your hands and write yes in the chat box. It will give me an idea about how deeply I need to discuss this particular term. Nobody has heard this term, cognitive bias? No. I have received one response. Okay. ठीक है. Okay, so let's divide this term into two parts, cognitive and bias. I'm pretty sure you would have heard the term bias. So what is a bias? Simple. What is the meaning of the term bias? Anyone? You can unmute yourself. You can write in the chat. You can give a one-word answer. What is the literal meaning of the term bias? Prejudice. Great.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good
Ma'am,
morning.
when we do unequal treatment based on certain factors, like we don't treat equal everyone, so there comes in a bias. Thank
Yes.
you.
Unfair, unequal treatment, differential treatment, partial treatment. Very good. I'm getting great words. Favorism, deviating from the norm, that is deviating from equality. All of these things lead to bias. Anything which is unfair, inclination, very good, again a very good term, inclination towards something, favorism towards something, being partial, being preferable, right? Whenever we talk about these things, we say that we are being biased, we are not being equal, we are not viewing everyone with an equal eye. Just like Dr. Priya in the beginning discussed that we interact with the manager in a different manner, with the colleague with a different manner. We are the same person, I am the same person, but I interact with different people differently because of this unfairness or partiality in my mind. So no matter how good a human being I am, I may have, yes, I may have preconceived opinions, and which may lead to a bias. So bias is something which is inclined, favorism, partiality. What is a cognitive bias? Cognitive is again a term which is used extensively in psychology. It's something, cognitive means something which is related to our brain or something which is related to our mind. So when we bring these two words together, cognitive bias, we are basically talking about a predisposition or a prejudice or a partiality or a bias which is there in our brain. Prejudice or for or against one person or group in an unfair way. Yes, perfectly, Dr. Devya.
Ma'am, good morning to
Consciously
you.
being biased. Yes, yes, sir.
Is this cognitive bias is intentional or unintentional?
Sorry, sir. I couldn't hear you. There's some noise behind you. That's right. Can you repeat it?
I think my question is whether cognitive bias is one is aware of or not aware. It
Okay,
does happen.
very good question. Can I know your name, please?
I'm Dr. Satbir.
Dr. Sadbir, it's a very good question, and this is something that I was going to come about. Whether we are we as individuals aware of our cognitive biases or not, and this is what the second part of the discussion is going to be. Once we understand what is cognitive bias, we need to understand: are we aware? Are we doing it in a conscious manner? Are we exercising this bias in a conscious manner, or are we exercising it in a subconscious manner without us being aware of things? Consciously being biased, Dr. Priya says that it is consciously being biased, but it is not always the case. Dr. Sadbir will take up this discussion, but if you could just mute your mic. Thank you so much. Now, whenever you are making judgments and decisions, and this is an answer to his question and a building upon this thing, whenever we are making judgments, whenever we are making decisions, whenever we are behaving in a particular manner, we like to think that we are very objective, we like to think that we are logical, we like to think that we are capable of evaluating all the information that is available in the environment, right? This is what we human beings like to think, that I am taking a decision, I have taken this factor into account, I have taken this factor into account, and I have taken all the information into account, and after that I am taking this decision. But human beings today are bombarded with so much of information on a daily basis that it is just not possible for your brain to process all the information, right? It is just not possible to be logical all the time. It is just not possible to be objective, unfair, unbiased all the time. It is not possible for your brain, no matter how much you try, because we are not computers. That is why we have data science, because we have developed all of these techniques, we have evolved, we have taken help of technology to help us take better decisions. But if you talk about human mind, unfortunately, we are not so capable enough to take unbiased, impartial decisions all the time. Therefore, your mind, your brain must resort to certain mental shortcuts to make decisions quickly and effectively. Ishika, if you could just move to the second and the third slide. I think we have completed the second slide, the third slide. Yeah, we talk about the mental shortcuts. You must resort to some mental shortcuts to make decisions quickly and effectively. And these mental shortcuts are something which pave the way for cognitive biases. These mental shortcuts are something which help you, not help, but which make you move towards cognitive biases. That's why it is said human is most dangerous animal. Okay, so a cognitive bias, I'll just come back to this definition once again so that can have a proper definition of this word cognitive bias. It is often a result of your brain's attempt to simplify information processing. Ishika, if you can move to the next slide. Yes. So a cognitive bias, if we have to define it, it is a result of our brain's attempt to simplify information processing. As I just told that it's not possible for us to evaluate all information. It's totally fine, Dr. Kumar. We are recording the session and it will be available to you. So as I've just said that it's not possible for a human mind to evaluate all the information. Therefore, to simplify information processing, our mind uses some kind of mental shortcuts. And when our mind uses these mental shortcuts, it leads to cognitive biases. I'm going to give you an example of these mental shortcuts, and I'm going to tell you whether these mental shortcuts are good or bad. And then you can decide yourself that is it something that we do consciously or not. So the first thing about cognitive bias is that it happens because our brain tries to simplify the information that it's getting from the environment. They are the rules of thumb. This cognitive bias, these mental shortcuts are the rules of thumb that help you make sense of the world and reach decisions with relative speed. So basically it helps you to take speedy decisions. These mental shortcuts, so you can understand in a very simple manner. So if you are going somewhere, just like Dr. Kumar is traveling right now, so if he knows that this is the path to reach from home to college and it's going to take 1 hour, but he knows that there's a shortcut in between. Using that shortcut, he can reach his college from home in 45 minutes, right? So when he uses that shortcut, he's able to reach in a much timely manner. He's able to speedily reach his particular destination. Similarly, when we use our mental shortcuts, we are able to take speedy decisions, right? So cognitive bias, mental shortcuts allow us to take decisions quickly. It helps to save time. And it reduces the complexities. It reduces the complexities of the information that is there in the environment. And I just said that they simplify the information by reducing it down so that it's easier for our mind, our brain to understand it. So whatever is there on the slide and whatever I've just told you right now, these are very, positive words: simplifying information, speedy decisions, saving of time, reducing complexity. So it seems like, we are defining cognitive bias in such a positive manner. Then what's the problem? Is cognitive bias good or is bad? We have defined it in a positive manner. So is it still bad? Are these mental shortcuts still bad or they are good? What do you think?
Most of the time, madam, it may be true. Sometimes it will backfire. So when we least expect this, and we may get unexpected results.
Definitely. Thank you so much, sir. So these as sir said that yes, these mental shortcuts are not necessarily all bad. In fact, psychologists believe that many of these biases serve an adaptive purpose. If these biases were not there, if these mental shortcuts were not used by human beings, it could not have been possible for us humans to have survived and evolved over so many decades. Dr. Simon says that information is simplified, but is critical thinking involved in cognitive bias? No, it is not. Because when we talk about critical thinking, we cannot, critical thinking and mental shortcut usually do not go hand in hand, because when we talk about critical thinking, we need to invest time, efforts, our cognitive strain to think about something in a critical manner, and it involves time. But when we talk about cognitive bias, when we talk about mental shortcuts, it is a different thing, and it is not connected with critical thinking. So no, critical thinking does not involve cognitive bias, because if critical thinking starts involving cognitive bias, then all our decisions, even rational decisions, will go haywire. So coming back to how good or bad they are, they have been serving, psychologists believe that they have been serving a good purpose, an adaptive purpose for a while for us. This can be vital if you are facing a dangerous situation or a threatening situation. So I'll just give you an example, which I think many of you would relate. So just go back to your memory and maybe think about an example where you are walking down a very dark street. It's a dark street, and it's a night time, and you're walking alone. And after walking for some time, you see that there's a shadow which seems to be following you constantly. What's going to be your reaction? You're walking in a road, it's a dark street, nobody is there, you cannot see someone, you're walking alone, it's night time, and you feel that there's someone following you, there's a shadow that you constantly keep on seeing. What's going to be your reaction?
Safety concern.
Safety concern. So what are you going to do?
Fear, a feeling of fear, maybe a feeling of harm. Someone is there to harm us.
Yes, you'll feel that there's someone following you to harm you. Therefore, you'll be fearful. You'll have concern for your safety. But what are you going to do in that case?
If
you're feeling fearful,
start walking faster.
Yes,
towards
great.
light.
Start walking
where people are there, where I can find some security.
Yes. Definitely, great. The normal reaction would be, oh my God, someone is following me. They are meant to do some harm. You start walking faster, you start running, maybe you start screaming, maybe you find some spot to hide, maybe you start calling someone frantically to come and help you, right? This is going to be your quick reaction, right? Your first reaction is going to be to run, hide, or seek help, because that is what your brain is wired to do. You're not going to stand there and think, okay, where is this shadow coming from? Let me do a research. Let me go back. Let me see from what time this shadow has been following me. Let me just go back and see that is there actually a human being following me, or is it some other shadow from somewhere and I'm being fearful for no reason at all. You're not going to do that, except in very rare situations. But the reaction at that point of time for most of us is going to either run, hide, or seek help, right? So you're not going to stand there and critically think or rationally think or evaluate all options, that where is the shadow coming from, let me see, and actually determine the source of the shadow. You are going to react instantly. So this is a mental shortcut. This is a mental shortcut that your brain is using to protect you from some kind of harm, although there might not be any harm at that point of time. I request Ishika to please mute the source of this disturbance. Please mute yourselves. I am able to hear some kind of a disturbance. Okay. Ishika or Harini, can you please mute the source of the disturbance? Right, thank you. So if our brains were bad at spotting predators or running away from danger, evaluating possible friends and enemies, the human race would have died out long ago, right? So that is why these mental shortcuts are not always bad. This reaction, this instant reaction that our brain gives, that our brain is wired to give, is there to protect us, to take quick decisions in an instance. And that is why they are not always bad, and they're not always taken in a conscious manner as well.
So Professor, this is Swati. Yeah, so you mean to say that this mental shortcuts are most of the time good in the situation of crisis to take quick decisions?
Yes, in the situation of crisis, these mental shortcuts help you, but they may also lead to an irrational decision. In a situation of crisis, in a situation where it's essential for you to take quick decisions to protect yourself, definitely they are good. But in situations where rational thinking is required to take much bigger decisions, these mental shortcuts can actually be harmful because they often lead to irrational decisions. So it depends a lot on the situations.
Sure.
Professor, isn't it?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Professor, isn't right now we're talking about the Kahneman theory of system one and system two, isn't it? So this is what he suggested, that system one is the quick shortcuts that our minds take. But then there also is a point that Kahneman mentions, that this sort of thinking is also highly influenced by experience. So these mental shortcuts are highly influenced by experience, and hence these decisions become reinforced and strengthened over a period of time.
Yes, definitely. And it's great. Have you read Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman?
Yeah, I teach a course on decision making, which is based on System One theory and System Two theory by
Right.
Kahneman. So
Great.
definitely, this is quite interesting. But I just wanted to understand, then how do we, say that it leads to problems, because System One process of thinking is also quite critical. When we are taking, let's say, business decisions, or when I'm teaching students to take business decisions.
Right. So your question is that both system one and system two are important. Both of them are doing their own job. Then why is it that system one may put us in trouble sometimes? Is this your question?
Professor, the internet is a bit unstable. Could you please repeat? I'm so sorry.
Okay, Dr. Devika, what I just asked is that since you talked about system one and system two, right? And since you said that system one and system two both have their own job to do. System one gives us a method of taking quick decisions, which we are reinforced over a period of time. Is there a network issue from my end? Is my voice breaking?
Madam, clear, no issues.
Okay, so Dr. Devika is facing some issue. Dr. Devika, am I still not audible properly to you?
A bit better, Professor. Please
Okay,
continue. Thank
okay.
you.
So what I was saying is that since you're talking about system one and system two, so I'm just trying to understand your question first. So are you asking that if both system one and system two are meant to do their jobs, wherein system one is meant to help us take quick decisions, and these decisions are reinforced over a period of time, and system two is meant to do its own job of helping us take rational decisions, long-term decisions, etc. So why is it that we are saying that sometimes system one may lead us into some sort of trouble? Is it what you're asking?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking, because both these processes are absolutely pertinent for taking decisions on a daily basis, and system one equally helps in system two. So when you mention that there are certain pitfalls of system one, like you said that this decision cannot be rationalized. So that is where I just wanted to understand that why are we coming to this conclusion?
Okay. So over this session, when I'm going to take up certain kinds of cognitive bias, I'm going to tell you that why this bias may lead to problems for us, and why is it essential for us to be aware of this bias, and how can we, take advantage of this bias. So I'm not saying that these biases or the system one is wrong always, but as human beings, we need to know how to take benefit of these bias, how to take benefit of how the system one functions, how to take benefit of these mental shortcuts. Because we need to, if it's our mind, if it's our decision, right? System one and system two are both part of our mind. So if it is part of our mind, we need to ensure that it's helping us out. There can be certain situations where it is not helping us out. It's backfiring, as someone said, one of the participants said. So I'm not saying it's bad. They are perfectly doing their job, but we just need to be aware that this is a part of our brain, and this is how we need to take the best advantage to arrive at the best possible decisions, whether we are using system one or using system two. Does that answer your question, Dr. Devika? Also, I'll be taking up these biases one by one. So I think when I take them up and when I tell you that this is the pitfall of this bias, then I think it's going to be more clear that why we need to avoid that particular pitfall and how to use that to our advantage, in fact. Sister One
Sure.
thinking, thank you. Sister One thinking is more of hunch or intuition. Perfectly fine. It may fall prey to cognitive biases. That's the limitation of System One, I think. Yes, Dr. Arun, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so one by one, we are going to take up some of the most important biases that impact our brain. Also, I'll just like to put this across that, Ishika, if you could go to the previous slide, please. I'll just like to put this across that there are just more than 100 cognitive biases. There are so many so many cognitive biases, but it's again not possible for us to cover all of these. So we are just going to cover a few of them. Those important biases, what they do, how they limit our decision making, our judgments, and our behavior ultimately. So I would like to take 2 minutes or 3 minutes to do a very small activity with you. I would request you to maybe take out a sheet of paper or maybe just open your phone. I just want you to write something somewhere. I'm going to show you something. I hope you can see this. It's a pen. Can you see this pen?
Yes.
Okay, take it. So this is a pen and this is not a normal pen, right? I'm going to tell you that this pen is very unique because it's an all-in-one pen. First of all, it's a cuboid in shape, which is a very unique shape. We usually have pens in a round shape, but this is a cuboid shaped pen. It changes colors. So if I press the back of this pen, I press it once, it changes, its colors changes to black. I press it twice, its colors changes to red, and I can have it in 10 different colors, right? This pen's back can be used as a duster as well. So this pen cannot just write on a paper. It can write on a desk. It can write on a whiteboard. It can write on a blackboard. It is so flexible and it works as a duster as well. And it's not harmful at all. Unlike a marker, a permanent marker, which may do harm to your skin, it's not at all harmful. So it's a multi-purpose pen which changes colors, which does multiple works. So this pen is up for sale. I am the seller of this unique pen and all of you are my buyers. Now, I want to sell this pen to you and obviously I need to quote a price for this pen since this is a unique pen. So I will tell you what the price of this pen is. So the price of this pen is the last 2 digits of your phone number, right? So again, this entire whatever experiments, whatever small activities that I'm going to do, it's based on a book, which is Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, which I'm going to provide a reference to at the end. The slide has all the references. But I just want you to assume that the price of this pen is the last 2 digits of your phone number. And you can just write down the last 2 digits of your phone number on a paper or in your phone, in your notes, wherever you want to write it. We have about 101 participants in this session. And I request you to please assume that I'm selling this pen to you and the price of this pen is equal to the last 2 digits of your phone number. And obviously it's going to vary for each one of you, right?
Few key members will have 00 in their phone number.
Perfectly fine. No, I don't want you to write it in the chat box. Please do not write it in the chat box. Just keep it to yourself. Just keep it to yourself. No matter whether it's 0001, whatever, that is the price. Okay, even if it's 00, I may be just happy enough to offer it at a price of 02. And this price is in rupees. So once you have written down, do not write it on the chat box. Do not write it. Just keep it with yourself, right? So once you have written the price, I want you to think yourself and give a bid for this pen, right? Again, no need to write it in the chat box. Just write your bid. Wherever you have written the last 2 digits of your phone number, which is the pretended as the assumed price of this pen, just below that you can write what is the bid for this pen? How much are you willing to bid for this pen? How much price are you willing to pay for this particular item? Just write it down. And once you are done, now you can put it in the chat box. Two things. One, your assumed price, that is the last 2 digits of your phone number, and then your bid price. Okay, exactly this format which Dr. Piyush gave. Can I have more answers? The assumed price, which is the last 2 digits of your phone number, followed by your bid price for this particular pen. Okay, so we have good amount of answers in the chat box. It's a great thing. Let me just scroll up so that I can have a look at these answers one by one. Great, great, great. Great. Okay, let me just scroll up once again. So Dr. Piyush says 18 and 100. Then we have Dr. Anindya says 36 and 30. Dr. Priya 96, 120. Dr. Sushmita 47 and 30. It will just take me a few moments to scroll down. Okay, so it's not just me, but all of you can actually see these, numbers on your screen in the chat box. Can just any one of you is willing to just scroll through these numbers quickly and tell me, is there a relation that you find between the assumed price, that is the last 2 digits of your phone number, and the bid price? Any sequencing, any pattern, any kind of relationship? No need to apply any technique of statistics, but generally, can you see a pattern here?
It's generally somewhere near that assumed price only. Like if my assumed price is 36, my bid price will be in between of 30 to 40. Like something, except for a few cases. In most of the cases, it's like that.
Thank you so much.
So bid price is lesser than the assumed price?
Bid price is lesser than the assumed price. Okay.
Assumed price and bid prices are somewhat related, means they are nearby. In 90% cases, I agree with Anatya, it's nearby. People have noted it down nearby their assumed prices.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Sushmita. Thank you so much, Dr. Anindya. Thank you so much, Dr. Swati. And yes, this is a very right observations. Your bid prices is near to your assumed price. So if you, except in a few cases where there's a huge difference, for example, in case of Dr. Piyush, there's a huge difference, there's a huge gap between the bid price and the assumed price. But in most of the situations, the bid price is very near to plus minus 10, plus minus 15, plus minus 20, very near to the assumed price, that is the last 2 digits of your phone number. Dr. Ashita says that, okay, just let me see. Dr. Ashita says mostly people want to pay a lower price. Okay, this can be one observations, that you do not find this pen very unique, so you want to pay a lower price. Okay. It's of round value. Anchoring bias. Yes, this is what we were going to come to, anchoring bias. Thank you so much, Dr. Vijay. Ishita, when can we move to the next slide? So I did not give you a bid price. I just explained what this pen does, right? This pen is actually very unique. Now, I just told you that this pen is unique. I never told you that it was hypothetical pen or real pen, but I asked you to assume it's a real pen with real unique qualities. And you could have given a unique price for this pen. You could have given a higher bid for this pen because you know how the bid system works, right? This is the one of a kind pen. But what we observe here and what I'm coming to here is the anchoring bias, which is emerged from the term anchor. When we say that your bid price is near to your assumed price, we talk about the term anchor. We talk about a bias which is called the anchoring bias. Now, this experiment was conducted by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and what they did was very similar to the activity that I just did. What they did was they asked the students in their class or their observants or their participants, they gave various items to their participants, they described the qualities, and then they asked their participants to do the exact thing. They asked their participants to take the last two digits of their social security number and write it down as the assumed price of that item, and then they asked the participants to bid. And what they observed was that people who had high social security numbers paid up to 346% more than those with low social security numbers. So if people had social security's number ranging from, I believe, 80 to 99, they paid around $26 for an item. But the people, the participants which had a social security number ranging from 0 to 19, they paid around $9 only. So there was a huge difference between those who had lower security numbers and those who had high security numbers. This is what we call the anchoring bias. Now, before we formally describe what an anchoring bias is, I would like to ask you, what comes to your mind when you think of this word which is mentioned on the screen, anchor? What comes to your mind when you think of the word anchor?
What is attached to a ship?
A ship. A ship comes to my mind. Or a boat that is anchored to the shore.
Perfect, perfect. Ship, boat.
A hook.
A hook, great. Which holds everything together, perfect, being stable. Really nice, really nice. So yes, an anchor helps in all of these. An anchor in literal terms, it's actually a heavy object. Ishika, next slide, please. An anchor is this, right? When we think of ship or boat or holding something together or a hook, this kind of an image may come to your mind. Something which holds the ship to or moves the ship to, a shore. So most probably you think of a heavy metal object just like this, which is attached to a chain, which is used to keep a ship to the sea bottom or near the seashore. And this is precisely what this term refers to in psychology as well. Anchoring is a term which is used to describe the common human tendency to stick to or to rely heavily on the very first piece of information that they receive or the very first piece of information that they learn. Ishika, can we move to the next slide, please? Anchoring, right? Anchoring bias is a bias of our mind which arises because we as humans tend to rely or stick to the very first piece of information that you receive. The very first piece of information, what was the first piece of information that you received? I just told you something about this pen, and then I told you that assume that the price of this pen is the last two digits of your number. So someone said 56, 56 is the last two digits of my phone number. So I assume that the price of this pen is 56. Now, when I tell you that, see, this pen is so unique, this has so many qualities, how much are you willing to pay? Keep aside the assumed price of the pen. Keep aside whatever price I told you. But then you need to bid for a price. What price are you willing to pay? Someone said 80, someone said lower than that, 10 plus minus 10, 20, 30. So the first piece of information that you received, 56, subconsciously you rely on that information. Subconsciously you stick to that information, you hold on that to the information, you hold to that price, and then on the basis of that first price that you received in your mind, you decide the subsequent price of this item. You decide what is going to be the bid price of this item, right? This example is just based on an experiment that was conducted by a few researchers and psychologists who are very famous, but in your real life as well, you can see multiple examples of this. When you're going to the market to purchase something for the very first time and you do not know what price this item holds, right? You see an item, you see the price, or the seller tells you a price, right? Even if you want to bargain, you bargain over and below that price. You do not go to a huge extent. You do not divert to a huge extent from that price. You stick to that price, and you may reduce 100 rupees, or you may bargain to up to 200 rupees. Let's assume if it's a very big item, it's a very big household item, you may bargain for the reduction of 500 or 1000 rupees. But you do not go to huge extents to change the price, because the anchoring effect makes you stick to that information. And I'm not talking about all items that you purchase. I'm specifically talking about those items that you usually purchase for the first time, for which you have not done extensive research, or you do not know what a rational price or the actual worth of that item may be. Can you think of any other examples, anything that you have faced in your life, which you think may actually be because of an anchoring bias?
When we go for a commercial buying where bargaining is rampant, they will tell very high price to start with. And we think value of this is this much, and we actually got a very nice discount. We also know logically it's not a real discount. Even on the online website, it will say price is this, selling price is this, discounted is this, and special offer for you is this, like 5 grades. Then also we think we have won a nice, great deal.
Yes, definitely. Even though we may know that actually it's not a very good deal, but our mind convinces us that, see, this was the price. You're moving away this much. So it's perfectly fine. Although there's one more bias which comes on when we talk about marketing here. Right. But I'm not going to touch on that bias. But yes, we usually stick on to that information, and we think that itna move kar jana or moving away this much is fine. It's perfectly fine. It's the anchoring bias which makes us do that, which does not allow us, which may not allow us in some situations, again, not in all situations, which may not allow us sometimes to move away from that first piece of information and think rationally about what the worth of that item actually is. I've just given you an example. We have been discussing examples in financial terms only, but there can be multiple other examples as well. So, as shocking as it may sound, someone wants to say something? Someone has unmuted themselves. Perfectly fine. Go ahead. Okay. Right. So it may sound a little shocking, but sometimes even unrelated information can act as anchors. So the little activity that we did, I just said that assume that the last 2 digits of your phone numbers is the price, right? I could have said anything. I could have said, assume that your age is the price. Assume that the number of teaching experience of yours is the price. This information is totally unrelated to the price of a pen, right? But seemingly unrelated information can also act as anchors that influence your decision making. Okay. There's one more, again, very famous example. This was again one experiment that was conducted by Daniel Kahneman. Under this experience, what happened was that, and this is going to be the last example, and again, this is an example which does not relate to financial thinking or financial purchases or financial decision. So an experiment was conducted, again a very famous experiment by Daniel Kahneman. Under this experiment, several judges with more than 15 years of experience, these were judges, several judges were called together. They had more than 15 years of experience, and each one of them was asked to read a case about a woman who had been caught stealing. So they were asked to read a case about a woman who had been stealing. And then the judges were asked to roll a dice. The catch was, the judges did not know that the dice was rigged. It was manipulated. And when you roll the dice, it would either land on a 3 or a 9, no other number at all, right? So each of those judges was first given a case to read about a woman who was caught stealing. Then each of these judges were given a dice. They were asked to roll that dice and just note down the number which came on that dice. So for some of the judges, the number which came on that dice was 3. For some of the judges, the number that came on the dice was 9. There was no other number because the dice was rigged. And the judges were unaware of this. They did not know that the dice was rigged. So as soon as the dice was rolled and the dice landed, each judge was asked a question. What is the exact prison sentence in number of months that the woman should be subject to. What is the number of months for which this woman who was stealing should be subjected to in prison? A very simple question. Now, obviously, if you are a judge that a woman has stolen something, obviously you on the basis of your past past experiences, you were just thinking, okay, this woman has stolen this amount, so I would subject her to maybe a prison of 12 months, 13 months, 5 months, whatever is the judge's experience. But what this experiment found was very shocking. So Ishika, if you could move to the next slide. Yes. So what they found was, the results are very surprising. The judges whose dice landed on a 3, they sentenced the woman to an average of 5 months, right? So different judges whose dice landed on a 3 gave different verdicts, that this woman should be subjected to 4 months of prison or 5 months of prison or 6 months of prison. On an average, it was 5 months, right? If we take an average of those judges whose dice landed on a 3, sorry, their average sentence was 5 months. Whereas the judges who rolled a 9 on their dice, they assigned an average sentence of 8 months, right? This is what you can see on your screen. This is no coincidence. The judges whose dice landed on a lower number, number 3, gave a sentence of an average 5 months, and the judges whose dice landed on a 9 sentenced the woman to a prison of an average of 8 months. Now, this number on the dice was totally unrelated to the case. This has nothing to do with the woman stealing, and the judges had so much experience. But despite that, the number on the dice acted as an anchor to make a decision about the duration of the sentence that woman should be subjected to. So you can see that this bias, this anchoring bias, even affected judges who had immense experience in their field, right? So this is how an anchoring bias can affect our thinking if we resort to these mental shortcuts without being aware of this. Had the judges been aware that the dice were rigged, or even if they're not aware that the dice was not rigged, if they would have taken a decision by keeping this dice number totally separate from their mind, from the case of that moment, they would have been able to take a rational decision about what should be the right sentence, that prison sentence that the woman should be subject to. But even they were subject to this anchoring bias. And this is a situation where this kind of a bias can actually be disadvantageous to someone, even though they had a huge experience in their field, right? So just in very simple language, if we had to explain the anchoring bias, we tend to cling on to a number, we tend to cling on to the piece of information that we receive and evaluate all other offers, all other things based on that previous number, even if that number is not relevant. It's not relevant to our decision making. Still we cling to it, still we hold on to it. And it affects our decision making, it affects our judgment, it affects our rationality, and affects our behavior as well. So now this anchoring bias is a part and parcel of our day-to-day activities. The examples, the activities, the experiments were just based on something that was conducted. But again, as I said, that this is something that if you are aware of, you can spot in your day-to-day activities, in whatever financial decisions or purchase decisions or any other decisions that you take. It can influence how much you're willing to pay for a product. If you're buying something for the first time, it can influence your salary negotiations with your employer as well. So there's an entire study which was conducted by Thorsten's son, that was his name, in the year 2011. And he suggests in the study that when you are in an organizational setting, right, whenever you're being employed somewhere in an organization, you may be hesitant to make a first offer. So we see in a lot of settings that, you know, whenever you're hired somewhere, the employer usually asks you at the end of the interview or after offering you the job, how much do you expect? How much remuneration or compensation or salary do you expect from this job? And usually, if I talk about myself, I am a person who's usually hesitant to talk about money or put my first bid across. And this may be the case with a lot of people. But Thorsten's son in 2011 study suggests that that being the first one to lay your cards down on the table, be the first one to initiate a bid, might be the actual best way to go forward, because whoever makes the first offer has an edge, since the anchoring effect will be there in both the minds. And this anchoring effect or this anchoring bias will essentially make that first bid or that number as the starting point of all further negotiation, right? So this example again is something that can be used this to our advantage only if we are aware of this thing, that yes, we should be making the first bid in a purchase decision. We should be the first one to make the first step forward, and we just be aware of the fact that there is some kind of an anchoring bias, and we need to take decisions after keeping this bias aside, after keeping that irrelevant information aside, and take a rational decision depending upon our research, depending upon our past experiences, and whatever we had developed and evolved over a period of time. Just one last question, and then I'm going to take the questions from you on this kind of a bias. Since we now, if we have understood what this bias is all about, how can we counteract this? Ishika, next slide, please. How can we ensure that we are able to safeguard ourselves from this bias, from the negative effects of this bias? How can we safeguard ourselves? What can we do?
Ma'am, we need to have a rational thinking. We need to be rational at all times rather than anchoring our thoughts to a particular bias. We should always have a rational thinking. We should weigh the costs and benefits before we make any kind of perception towards things.
This is the perfect way to go forward, that we make a rational choice, we do the pros and cons, cost benefit analysis, but in many situations, sometimes it's not possible. So this is the perfect answer. This is the perfect way to go forward. And this is what Dr. Devika also said, that this is the work of system 2. So for those of you who are not aware about system 1 and system 2, it's perfectly fine. System 1 is something which takes quick decisions, mental shortcuts, and system 2 is a part of our brain which takes rational decisions, slowly, critical thinking, evaluating all the information. So yes, what Dr. Sushmita said is that we should, to avoid this anchoring bias, the perfect way to go forward may be to switch to system 2, wherein you do a cost benefit analysis, you weigh the pros and cons of a financial or purchase decisions, and then you go forward. But okay, take information from different sources rather than sticking to the first piece of information. Very good, very, very, very good, Dr. Simon. Yes, as you can see that this anchoring bias arises because we stick to the first piece of information. We do not do this consciously. We do not hold on to the first piece of information consciously, right? But we do so. So another way to move forward is that we are aware that anchoring bias is real, it's going to impact us. And by being aware, we ensure that we take information from various sources. We know that this is the first piece of information and I don't have to rely on it. I do not have to stick to it. Only like if you're just aware of this fact that this is the first piece of information and there's a possibility that my mind sticks to this information and takes a wrong decision, if you're aware of this thing, you will automatically take a step back. You will automatically take all the, like not all, it's not possible to take all information account, but you will take information from different sources into account. Or as Dr. Nupur said, that you will first verify the information at your hand by doing some sort of preliminary research or talking to a different kind of people, determining the worth of that particular purchase or product, then finally arrive at what is the right price of that product, what is the right prison sentence that should be given to that particular woman, or whatever XYZ the case may be, right? So even if you do not take a hugely rational approach, you need to come somewhere in between. And to come somewhere in between, the first step is to be aware that anchoring bias is real. It affects your decision making. So you do not have to rely on the first piece of information. You need to take a step back. You need to take information from multiple sources. Invest some amount of time, even though you cannot invest a huge amount of time. Invest some amount of time to verify the information at hand. And the second thing, make the first bid. Right? Make the first bid. If you are in case of a salary negotiation, make a first bid. Set it high, set it low, as per your own convenience, as per what you think is the work, as per your previous experiences, as per the industry standards. Set that bid as per yourself, and then keep your negotiations. Ensure that your negotiations, the anchoring bias will ensure that your negotiations are around it. The last thing that I said was actually about how you can use anchoring bias to your advantage, right? So to protect yourself from the anchoring bias, just be aware that you do not have to rely on the first bit of information. To use the anchoring bias to your advantage, make the first bid. Set it high or low as per your own research so that you can have an edge, right? How to deal with anchoring bias. That's what's on the slide, and there's no answer on the slide because that is what we have discussed. So this was the first bias, first cognitive bias. We are at 10:40. Okay. Any doubt in this before we move on to the second bias? Once we complete the second bias, we are going to take a break. Essential. All right. Okay, so we are going to move to the next bias. Before we move on, again, there's a small question that I would like to ask, a small activity. So again, please listen to this question very carefully. So you are a person, each one of you is a person who likes to watch circus, right? And I tell you that a circus is coming to your hometown, wherever you live, it's coming to your hometown. It's a very fun circus and it's for 1 hour, and the ticket is available for rupees 500. It's on this Saturday. The ticket is available for 500 rupees. Since you like circus, you like to watch, and you are free on that particular weekend, you go and buy the ticket for 500 rupees. Now, after 2 days, I come to you and tell you that, do you know there's another circus which is coming to your hometown, and it is even better. It is even more fun. It is even more entertaining. It's even more famous. And you know what? The price of the ticket is rupees 250. So what you do is, since you like watching circus, you go and buy the ticket for rupees 250, right? So now you have a ticket for rupees 500 for one circus, which you're going to watch on this weekend. And you have another ticket for rupees 250 for another circus that you're going to watch. Now, coincidentally, what happens is that the date of the second circus is coinciding with the date of the first circus. So both the circus are taking place on the same weekend, on the same Saturday, right? And you have bought both the tickets, and you cannot sell the ticket to someone else. You cannot exchange the ticket. You cannot get the ticket refunded. They fall on the same day, same time, right? And you have one ticket which cannot be replaced. Which circus will you go to? The one for which you paid 500 rupees or the one for which you paid 250 rupees? Dr. Piyush says that he will go for the circus for which he paid 500 rupees. Obviously, he paid a higher price for that. Come on. Dr. Priya says 500. Dr. Prasanth says 500. What about the other? You don't like watching circus? Okay, Dr. Indrani says 500. Nobody for 250. I just told you, okay. 500 rupees, assuming that it may be better. Okay. Dr. Ajay says 250. 500. Okay. Dr. Chinmoy says 250. Okay. Great. So we think rich. Okay. So I'll just move a bit up. Dr. Sumon says 500 rupees, assuming that it may be better. But Dr. Sumon, I just told Thank you so much, Dr. Divya, for putting that term across. A very beautiful and a very important term. Dr. Swati, how 200? You have purchased the ticket for 250. I think you mean 250, right? Okay, okay. Thank you so much for your answers. Yes, thank you, Dr. Swati. Thank you so much for your answers. So I'll just go back to what Dr. Suman says, that rupees 500, assuming that the 501 circus is better. But I just told you that, you know, the circus of which offers you a price, which for which the ticket is rupees 250 is much better, much entertaining. I said this line in the beginning. So what are we doing here? Most of you said 500 rupees, right? And if I would have been in your case, again, I think this would be our thinking that here is one circus for which I paid 500 rupees. Here is one circus for which I paid 250 rupees. I spent more on this circus. So obviously I should reap the benefits of this circus because I paid more for this. Okay, you told me that this circus is much better, much entertaining, much bigger, much famous, but doesn't matter. I spent 500 rupees on this, so obviously I'm going to go for this circus, right? Please correct me if I am wrong in this. For those of you who said 500, if you said 500 because of some other reason, you can just unmute yourself and let us know about it. We have to look for value, not money. Okay, Dr. Ajay. We should actually do that. But here a lot of us said 500. And Dr. Piyush says that we think rich, that is why. Okay, so out of those who said 250, can any one of you just put it in the chat box or unmute yourself and tell us why 250? Why would you go for the circus for which you purchase a ticket worth rupees 250? So Dr. Swati says 250, Dr. Chinmoy says 250, Dr. Ajay Vikram says 250. Why 250? Why would you go for the second circus? To check whether it's worth 250, otherwise it's only 250 we lose. Okay. Very cool answer. Thank you, Dr. Shamsi. Okay, so Dr. Ajay says, as you mentioned, it's better than the other one. Yes, I did mention that the circus for which the price of the ticket is 250 is better than the other one. Okay, so a lot of us said 500, and I just gave you the reason why a lot of us would say 500. Dr. Ajay says we would prefer quality over the price that we said. Circus was held by a local brand. Dr. Usha, I did not say anything of this sort, but okay, you can go ahead assuming that. But anyways.
Professor Snigdha here.
Yes, doctor.
So what I feel like 500 is worth enough because I know that circus is good. And even if I am hearing from others on that basis, I have purchased by giving 250, but still I would prefer to go by my decision. Like if it is coming on the same day, so definitely I would prefer the 500 one. Thank you.
So doctor believes that 501, although someone told her, I told her, or someone told her that the one with the 250 is much better, but she believes that she should rely on her own judgment. And she believes that if she paid a higher price for the first circus, it may be of a good and a better quality. That's why she goes ahead with the one for which she paid a ticket price of 500 rupees. Value for money, value, I mean the entertainment here. Okay, Dr. Vishali. So you believe that value for money would be higher? I believe this is what you mean to say. Okay, great. Thank you so very much for being so responsive, first of all. And let's now come to this concept. It's a great thing that all of you think in multiple manners. Although for those of you who said 500, majority of you had one reason, that the money that you paid is higher, that's why you go ahead. Some of you had some other reasons. You think that it's your own decision or discretion to choose. Dr. Suman says, I think that human psychology works. The higher the price, the better the quality, though in reality, it may not be true. Perfectly stated, Dr. Suman. And this is one of the reasons behind the concept that we are going to discuss. The thing that I said, that when we pay a higher price, we believe that it must have a greater quality. Although I just told you that I may be someone who just told you that, see, the 251 is a better circle. I may be an expert. I may be a circus entertainer myself, and who told you that, the 251 is a better and a much quality circus. But it's your choice if you want to believe me or not. Let's keep that aside. But coming on to the concept that Dr. Suman also stated, and Dr. Divya, I think, also put across the word that I was looking for. This is an example of what we call the sunk cost fallacy. Ishika, if you could just move to the next slide, please. Yes. So sunk cost fallacy, right? Again, sunk cost is a word which is frequently used by economists. They are the famous. It's a very famous term. It's a very famous subject of economics. And if you simply put it across, even if you're not from the finance background, it's very simple. It's a very simple term. So sunk costs are basically payments or investments which can never be recovered. Ishika, you can move to the next slide, please. So sunk costs are payments, investments which can never be recovered, and hence they should not be considered while taking future decisions. Now, when I talk about investments, when I say that you have done some investment, I do not just mean monetary investment. It can be investment of time, effort, money, right? It can be an investment of anything. If you have invested some resources into something, right, and you have done that, sunk costs are those payments. You cannot recover them. In this case, in this example, you paid 500 rupees for one circus, you paid 250 rupees for one circus, and I just told you they cannot be recovered. Refund, you cannot take a refund, you cannot sell them to someone else. You just have them. You have invested a total of 750 rupees, 500 plus 250. You have invested 750 rupees and you cannot recover them, right? And now, since these are the costs, these are the payments, these are the investments which have already undertaken, they cannot be recovered. They should not impact rationally, they should not impact your future decisions. So if I tell you that, ma'am or sir, you have already invested 750 rupees in totality, now I'm telling you that, see, the second circus is much more entertaining, it's much more bigger, it's famous than the first one, then your decision should be taken independent of the investments or the payment or the sunk costs that have been incurred by you. This is what sunk cost means. And if you're not doing that, you are a victim of sunk cost fallacy. I will just give you a few more simpler examples which does not involve financial investments, right, which may be more relatable to you. So just raise your hands and put in the chat, put yes in the chat box. How many of you have ordered a lot of food in a fancy restaurant? You went to a fancy restaurant, it's a good restaurant, unique restaurant, right? You went there, you ordered a lot of food, but you couldn't eat all of it. You knew that you have ordered a lot of food, but still you just overeat because you want to get your money's worth. How many of you have been in a situation? Dr. Piyush, Dr. Anindya, went to a restaurant, ordered too much, do not have that appetite. You're the only one, or you have family members, but you do not have that much appetite, but still you overeat. You want to finish it because you paid money for it. Okay, happened with some of you. Great. Another situation. How many of you have some kind of unworn clothes in your closet? How many of you have some kind of clothes in your wardrobe cupboard, but you do not wear them or you do not throw them out because they were expensive? You cannot wear them right now. You cannot wear them because they do not fit you, but still they are in your cupboard or your closet because they were expensive. You bought them some time back, they are expensive, and your heart doesn't allow you to give them to someone else or just donate it somewhere. How many of you have faced that situation? Dr. Snigdharani, Dr. Anusha, Dr. Anubhuti, great. Dr. Shamsi as well. Okay, so these are very normal situations, right? Nothing related to money. I agree, they are there. It's nostalgia, what to do. Okay, Dr. Piyush, that might be maybe one reason that you're attached to those clothes, right? So that is why you do not want to throw them or do not want to donate them, because you wore them once. But I gained weight recently. What if I become thin again? Again, one reason. What if this happens? What if I lose weight? What if I'm once again able to fit on in those clothes? So again, one reason why you do not want to get rid of those clothes. What if this happens? Even though you may not have, space in your closet to keep them, but still you keep them because of nostalgia, or that future may, hopeful that the future may give you a opportunity to wear them once again, or you have memories attached with it, as Dr. Vishali just pointed out. So broadly, if you have experienced any one of these and you keep those clothes with you, not because of memories or not because of hope, but because they were expensive, you purchased them because they were expensive, and that is why you are keeping them. Maybe they're out of fashion, but still you are keeping them. Maybe you do not have any hope of wearing them again, but still you are keeping them because they were expensive. Or you are overeating at a restaurant even if you do not have an appetite, because it was a fancy restaurant, you ordered food, it was expensive food, and you must eat it because you need to get your money's worth. If you have been in such situations, or let me give you one more common example, a very personal example indeed. If you are in a relationship, if you are in a personal relationship, right, for let's assume 2 years, 3 years, and you have been investing your time, your efforts, your tears, your everything into that relationships, but you know that the relationship is toxic, you know it's not going to work out, but still you stick on to that person because you know that 2 saal mehnat kari hai. I have been with this person for 2 years, invested so much, shared so many secrets with this person. How can I now leave after 2 years, even though you know that's not going to work out? If you have been in any of these situations, you fell victim to the sunk cost fallacy. Ishika, next slide, please. So these are all examples of sunk cost fallacy. Individuals commit the sunk cost fallacy when they continue a behavior as a result of previously invested resources, right? You can ignore the picture on the slide. I'll come to that example, but I need you to focus on the words that I'm saying. When you continue a behavior as a result of some previously invested resources, these resources can be money, time, energy, efforts, pain, tears, anything that you have already invested, anything you have already undertaken. All of these are sunk costs which influence your behavior. These things should not influence your behavior. These things are the things that you have already invested. They have gone down the drain. You cannot recover them. You cannot recover the money. You cannot recover your lost energy and efforts and time. It's not possible. But if you let these investments, which are actually sunk cost, impact your future decisions, if you're not able to stop eating food even when you're full and you know it may harm your health later on, if you're not able to get out of a toxic relationship although you know it's not going to work out, if you're not able to take a rational decision because you think that you have paid more for something, then you are stuck in a sunk cost fallacy, right? Not only humans, but even rats and mice are sensitive to the sunk cost, right? If you offer a piece of cheese or anything to a rat or mice, and they have made constant efforts going on and on about to eat that, but still they are not able to eat that. You must have seen that cycle. They go on and on and on. Rats and mice run, they try to chase that piece of cheese or whatever food is there, and they're still not able to eat it. They may be tired, but they still do not give up. They keep chasing it, not because they are hungry, but because they think that they have put in so much efforts to chase this, so let's put in more, let's put in more, let's put in more, and they may die because of that. They may die because of that excessive exhaustion, not because of hunger. They die because of that excessive exhaustion, but they do not give up. They do not let go of that because they believe that I have put in so much efforts, so thoda sa aur, more, and then they die, right? And this is an actual study which was conducted in 2018. So this is what the sunk cost is about. And this bias is the sunk cost fallacy that a lot of us are trapped in. Now, any queries up till now? Any experience or any comments that you would like to make, or anything you would like to share that you have faced related to this? Would really like to hear your thoughts. Anyone, anything, any similar situations or any queries that you might have?
So this also, Professor, works the sunk cost theory or sunk cost fallacy is in the organizations as well. As somebody is due for promotion after 2 years and he or she did not get it, and then she says, okay, next 6 months we'll see. For 1 year I have already invested 2 years here, and let's see one more year. So is this a very common phenomena? Is it related to the sunk cost fallacy?
Yes, depends upon how you perceive it. So in case of a promotion in an organization, if let's assume you have invested 2 years, right? If you have invested 2 years just for the sake of promotion, right? And you know that someone else has got that promotion and there's no chance that you're going to get promotion, right? But still you continue to work for that promotion. Why there's no chance? Because of maybe, a trend in that organization that only the owners relatives get promotion or something of that sort, and still you're not able to come off that thing. You know that you're not going to get promotion because this is the trend in the organization, but still you are continuously putting efforts thinking that maybe not today, maybe after 2 years, maybe after 6 more months. Then it's a sunk cost fallacy. But if you're doing that work and in that organizations, the promotion takes place based on work only, and that's why you're still doing work, still putting efforts, then it's not a sunk cost fallacy. Because in this case, promotion will ultimately take place based on your seniority or the amount of hard work that you put in. It's going to reap efforts ultimately, and it's going to impact your future decision making. So in a very simple way to determine whether a situation involves sunk cost fallacy or not is just see that you have invested some resources. Now, if you just let go of that investment, if you just stop thinking about it, is it going to impact your future decisions or not? This is a very simple way to think about it. If you think, you have already invested 750 rupees, 500 plus 250, you're not going to get a refund. Now, what decision you make, whether you want to go to the first circus or the second circus, the investment should not hamper that decision. If that investment hampers that decision, it is a sunk cost fallacy because those investments are sunk cost. But if that investment is essential to making the future decisions, if that investment of 750 is essential to make that future decision, then those investments are not sunk cost. Dr. Deva asked, are sunk costs bad then when it comes to taking apt decision? Okay, so I'll give you a very general answer for all the bias, whether it's the anchoring bias, the sunk cost fallacy or anything. I wouldn't say they are good or bad, right? The word that I used in the beginning was it depends upon situation and whether you are able to use that particular bias to your advantage then. So we cannot draw a line and say that sunk costs are bad, sunk costs are good, anchoring is bad, anchoring or good. You cannot do that because this is something which your mind works on. These are some things which enable your mind to take quick decisions. So whether they may be good in some situations, they may be bad in some situations, what decides it whether you are able to take advantage of them or not? So if you let sunk cost put you into a sunk cost fallacy, if you let sunk cost make you take a bad decision, then sunk cost fallacy is bad. But if you're aware that this is a sunk costs themselves are just costs, right? Some costs that have been incurred somewhere, sometime. But if you take that sunk cost that I have already incurred this is a sunk cost. I realize this is a sunk cost, and you do not let them affect your future decisions. They're not bad. They're not harmful, right? So sunk costs themselves cannot be bad or good. It depends upon how you let them take disadvantage of you or how you take advantage of them by being conscious about how you are perceiving them to be. Bad experiences in the past cannot be reverted, but still it may come to mind. It may be irrelevant to current scenarios. So is it also a sunk cost? Bad experiences that you have had in the past, mistakes or failures that you have in the past, they cannot be reverted, but you can take learnings from them, right? They may be irrelevant to the current scenario, but you may take learnings from them for future decision making or for future experiences. So they may not be a sunk cost as such, because those are experiences. You did not, like, these are not investments of time, money, efforts. Those are experiences, and experiences often give you some learnings, as Dr. Raja says, they help you in the learning curve. So agar aap apne bad experiences ko, sorry, if you let those bad experiences hamper your mental health, hamper your future decision making, hamper your behavior, makes you rude towards others, then it's bad. But if you take learnings from those experiences, those failures, those mistakes, you can convert them into a learning curve, and it become relevant and useful for the current scenario. It may be helpful to you in the current scenario. So not necessarily categorizing them into the sunk cost category, because those are experiences. But yes, you can definitely decide whether you want to take advantage of them or not. All right, so I'll just refer to the picture that's there on the screen. So what is this picture all about? Can you just make a guess? Where's this picture taken from? What does this picture depict? Random guess. Indian mythology. A war. Where did a war take place in Indian mythology? A huge war in the Indian mythology. Mahabharata. Thank you so much, Dr. Sushmita. So this is a scene from Mahabharata. Most of you would have heard about the great ancient Indian epic, wherein Yudhishthir, who is the king of Hastinapur, he loses his kingdom, wealth, brothers, and he loses his wife in a game of gamble. This tale is also a classic example of the sunk cost fallacy, which incentivized the king to continue the game in the hope of negating the previous losses. He gave everything. He's lost his kingdom, wealth, brothers, wife, because he kept on thinking that maybe just one more bet and he'll win all that back. Maybe just one more bet. He was not aware. He was not thinking properly that whatever he has lost, kingdom, wealth, whatever he has lost is lost. He was just hoping that maybe he'll recover. And in that hope, without realizing that all that is a sunk cost, he kept on playing and he lost everything. Just by hoping that maybe he can negate the previous losses. So this is again a classic example of sunk cost fallacy, and you can just see where it dates back to. So last thing before we go on to the break.
So maybe one question. Can I put one question?
Yes.
So in that case, can you say gambling is also, sort of sunk cost? So when you gamble.
When you gamble and when you lose something, right? Now, what happens in a gambling is you are not sure that whether your next move would actually make you win or lose. And when you're not sure what your next move is going to do, right, your previous moves are useless. Like, your previous moves should not have an impact on the future moves. So those previous moves are actually sunk costs. And if you see it from this way, yes, gambling, the moves that you make in gambling, the losses that you take, they are some decisions whether you want to continue with the gambling or not.
Because if we connect, the kings move on to have battle after the battle just to save their honor and pride. And despite that they have lost, they move ahead that maybe this time I'm going to prove it. Maybe they so if it is sunk cost kind of a thing, so similarly I think similarly the gambling would be sunk cost.
So that's what I said, the moves in the gambling are actually sunk costs, which ultimately lead to the king taking a decision of a battle, which was, I shouldn't be commenting on it, but a lot of researchers do say that this is something that could have been avoided if the king was aware that this gambling, all of these moves should not be taken into account, and I should stop here. I should stop eating, even if though I have paid a price. I should stop cluttering my cupboard with the clothes, even those are expensive, but they do no longer fit me. So yes.
Thank you.
Welcome. So if this is the case, how do you free yourself from this fallacy? We now know that it's very easy to fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy because we are emotionally invested in whatever money, time, efforts, tears, resources we have committed in the past. So how do we free ourselves from this? Any way anyone can think of? It's a very simple method. Very simple way is just, again, just be aware. If you're just supposed to take them into account while taking future decisions, if you're just aware of this thing, it will help you. What we don't understand as humans is that what's done is done. There's nothing that we can do to regain the money that we have lost. There's nothing that we can do to regain the time and effort that we have lost. And if we continue to pursue that, if we continue to, keep saying that maybe, it's just going to make us unhappy. It's not going to have us get our money back. It's just going to make us worse off. We just end up digging a bigger and a deeper hole for ourselves. Therefore, you should stop throwing your good money after bad money in the hope of recovering that bad money. You should stop pursuing sunk costs in the hope that you're going to recover those costs. You should recognize that these are sunk costs, be aware, and that is the only way you can stop yourself from falling into the sunk cost fallacy.
It's just so easy to say, but it's really difficult to practice. Practically, in practical, people will leave their hope if they do such kind of things. Definitely, that's only the way when you are realizing the situation and you are moving forward, and you are living your whatever bad day you have and background. Okay, I'll not further prolong these things. I'll leave it right now, and I'll move it forward in something new venture, new hope, or new lights, and that's the new beginning of your life, you can say. And that decision is particular decision. Okay, whatever I have done, I'll leave it now, and now I'll start new beginning. And that decision is really very tough. We have a emotional baggage, and we always carry those things with us, hope that it will come back again. It will definitely it will happen. So such scenario, such situation, living background and moving forward and start new fresh and forgetting all the things whatever I have done is really tough. But definitely we have to do that. I am agreed with you. That's why one of the beautiful book is written, and that's called Now by Tolly Eckert, where he mentioned that you have to live your life now only. Forget about whatever happened in the past and start a new beginning every day. Every morning is a new day, and live a life on the new day, because you don't know when you will leave your last breath. So thank you very much for bringing these things in our thought.
Dr. Saleshwar, you have explained it in a very beautiful manner. And that is why, so, although so much research has been done on this, so many people and psychologists are aware of it, still they're not able to get them out of this fallacy. Because as I said, we all are human beings. We are emotional beings. We're the social animals, and we are emotionally attached to all of these things. So never say that it's going to be easy, but the only way. If you restart, but yes, beautifully explained. Dr. Saleshwar, if you just type in your box, meanwhile we are going to Dr. Minky, the session has not got over yet. We'll share the link once the session is over. All right, let's just resume since some of you are asking about the attendance and the feedback form. We're just going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes to discuss one more bias. And then we'll be ending this session wherein you will be receiving the attendance link and the feedback link. All right. Ishika, can you move to the next slide, please? Next slide. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about now, the halo effect and the Horn effect. So it is often said that the first impression is the last impression. Have you heard about this phrase? The first impression is the last impression?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. It's very common
Yes,
thing.
ma'am.
I think there's some disturbance from Dr. Priyanka's side. Can you please mute yourself, Dr. Priyanka? Or if Ishika, you can mute, please. Okay, so a very common phrase heard a lot of times. And if you ever look closely at your own evaluation of other people, you will find that when you first meet someone, the first impression plays a very huge role. If the first impression of the person is positive, you tend to ignore their negative characteristics and concentrate on their positive ones. You start seeing that person in the halo of the positive impression that you got. And on the other hand, if your first impression about a person is negative, you tend to ignore their positive characteristics and concentrate only on their negative ones. Now, I'm not saying that this is true for each one of us, right? Some of us who are aware that judging a person on the first look, on the first communication, on the first interaction is not a good idea, are safeguarded from this. But what researchers have found, what studies have shown is that actually why this phrase is used, first impression is the last impression, there's a reason behind it, because majority of the people have a tendency to fall into something that we call the halo effect and the Horn effect. Halo effect simply means that when you have a good positive impression of a person, very positive impression, you subsequently ignore their negative characteristics. And Horn effect simply means that if the first impression or the first few impressions of the person is negative, when you see negative characteristics of a person being highlighted continuously, then there's a probability that you will not like that person, and every subsequent positive action that they take, you tend to ignore them. This is the halo effect and the Horn effect. And why is it called the halo and the Horn effect? Ishika, if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is where the term comes from, the halo effect and the Horn effect. Halo is something, an object which is there on the head of an angel, and horn is something which is there on the head of a devil. So when we see something in a positive light, we call it the halo effect. And when we see something in the negative light, we tend to call it as the Horn effect. Definitely, ma'am, I'm going to share the PPT once the session ends. All right. So usually what happens is that this particular situation applies to a number of situations. So I'll take the example of a classroom because that is something that I think majority of us are accustomed to. So firstly, in the classroom, teachers are subject to the halo effect because when we are evaluating our students, when we are rating our students, if a teacher sees that a particular student is well behaved, we tend to assume, majorly we tend to assume that this student is going to be bright, diligent, more engaged. And even before we have objectively evaluated that particular student, we make this halo in our mind. We have a positive attitude towards that student in the mind, that this student is well behaved in the class, this student responds in the class. So definitely during the exam time, during the assignment time, during the test time, this student is going to be knowledgeable, and this student is going to score the highest marks, right? Has this happened with any one of you before? And it's perfectly fine to share it. This has happened to me multiple times in my class. I have a few students which respond, which are well behaved, which communicate effectively. And when it's time to take test, before even checking their test, I'm like, this student, good marks, must have done very good on the test, right? So this happens in the classroom. When these type of halo effects occur, they can actually affect the student's gaze as well. So it is possible that the student may not have performed well in the test, but still, because I have a perception in the mind, I have a positive halo for that student in my mind, I end up giving higher grades to that student. And this is not something that I'm saying from my experiences. This is based on research, the references of which you are going to find. Yes, Dr. Anandya. He has been at the receiving end of such positive halo effect, which worked in his favor. So this happens not only in the classrooms, this happened in multiple settings, in an HR interview, during the performance appraisal process. So if I take the example of a hiring process, right? During the hiring process, if the interviewer has had a bad impression of a candidate, let's assume if the interviewee enters and they, does not wish the interviewer, they do not greet them, they just sit down. No matter how good the interviewee may be, if the first impression of the interviewer is that, oh my God, they didn't greet me, oh my God, they didn't offer me a handshake, oh my God, they didn't ask before they settle down, they just settle down into the chair. If they develop this horn effect, if they develop this negative perception, no matter how good the interview went, no matter how good the interviewee was, it is possible that the hiring process turns out to be negative for that particular interviewee. They might ignore the interviewee, they might ignore their positive characteristics, they might ignore all the positive traits that they show. During the performance appraisal process, again, Ishika, you can move to the next slide, I believe, because I've mentioned the various situations in which this can happen, right? So during the performance appraisal process also, most managers like to think that they are being very objective, they are being very fair, they are being very impartial while completing the reviews for their employees or their subordinates. Some of the employers spend hours and hours over, each comment, each attitude, each score of their employee before they evaluate. But usually what happens when they step back, they will see that most probably they will witness that almost all of their high performers consistently score high in all categories. They will find that the employees or the subordinates who were close to them, who had shown positive characteristics in the immediate past or recently in the first impression, are going to score high, are going to get a promotion, are going to consistently being the high performers. And almost all of the low performance tend to score low in every category, not because the employees, the subordinates are bad, but because when the performance appraisal process takes place, the halo effect or the horn effect is still there subconsciously in the minds of the appraisers. Again, I'm telling you this is not true for all managers, all the performance appraisal process, but there are situations, there are multiple corporates where halo effect and horn effect creeps in during the interview process, during the hiring process, and during the performance appraisal process. They do fall victim to halo and horn effect. Dr. Ajay says that many things goes on face value as well. True, especially in corporates. Research suggests that attractive, good-looking people get paid more. Oh my God, this is very true. Thank you so much, Dr. Piyush, for putting this across. Research does suggest that people who are attractive, they are good-looking, they are well-dressed, they are perceived to be people with high values. They are perceived to be people with good communication skill, good, work ethics, and therefore they are offered a higher pay as compared to other people who may be good, maybe having a degree from a good institution, may have a good work experience, but still they may not be good looking or attractive. They end up paying a lower pay. And again, this is all based on research. So what happens is, so I'll just put across the study. Ishika, if you could just move on to the next slide. So there was a study undertaken in 2007 by Pronin, which highlights this bias during a selection process. So you can see on the screen, there are two pictures. So these two pictures were shown by Pronin in 2017 during the study. These two pictures of a man were shown to some students. So the picture above shows a suited man with a highly regarded degree. So the students were told that this picture, this man in the above picture is a man who's suited, who looks good, and he has a good degree. Whereas the other man, he's the exactly same man, his clothes are different. So the students were told, so this other man is wearing casual clothes. He's smiling, but he's wearing casual clothes. He has a good degree, but we do not know from which college, some non-descriptive college is holding this degree. Then the students were asked that if you were given $1,000, theoretically, if you were given $1,000, how much would they invest in each one of them? Like they were told that each one of them is an investment broker. One investment broker is wearing a good suit, he's smiling, he's holding a good degree. The second investment broker is wearing casual clothes, he's holding a degree, but we do not know which college he's holding a degree from. So if you had $1,000, how much would you give to each investment broker for investing your money? So the participants rated, the students rated the suited man as more competent. And on an average, they decided that they would give him around $535. And the students rated the second investment broker as less competent, and they on an average decided to give him just $350 for the purpose of investment. The participants did not go ahead. They did not do any background check. They did not ask any additional information that where did they complete their degrees from, which investment broking firm are they from, what do they represent, what are their qualifications, what is their past experiences. The participants were not concerned. They did not ask questions about this. They just saw two men, one man in a suit, smiling, decided to give him $500, about $500 for investment. Saw the second man wearing casual clothes, did not ask about which degree he's holding, did not ask about experience, just decided to give him $300 for the purpose of investment. They did not check the investment broker's credentials and all, because they did not think them as trustworthy. So this experiment was actually conducted and clearly pointed out towards the halo and the horn effect. Dr. Divya says that such effect biases are short-lived, ultimately output wins. Definitely in this case, whatever output is there in returns is obviously going to impact, but when you're actually taking the decisions, you are actually not taking decisions in the right manner because you are being affected by those effects. Dr. Kalam sir, Rabindranath Tagore is not so smart looking, but still we value them because of their contribution to the society. And this is exactly what our decisions should be based on: the values, the ethics of the people, their credentials, their trustworthiness, and not how they look. So this was just one experiment. You will come across multiple activities, experiments, and research that show that halo and horn effect actually exist, not only in classrooms, not only in organizations, but they exist in general routine activities of interactions that individuals take place. So last question, how are you as teachers, as consumers, as managers of organization, as leaders, how are you supposed to deal with this bias? How can you deal with this? So if you take the example of teachers, I just give an example that how the horn effect and the halo effect may have an impact on what the teachers think and grade their students. So how do you think that we as teachers or we as managers or leaders of an organization can deal with this halo effect and horn effect, which is a type of a cognitive bias? Anyone who's faced it or tried to overcome it or might like to put across any suggestions, stick to the facts, okay, to see whether the person performs the role of the assigned responsibilities, for which you'll have to wait, you'll have to observe, good, not make quick judgments. Again, Dr. Divya says that you need to wait, you need to check the facts, you need to see each and every aspect before making judgments, before thinking what that person is actually capable of, by not being judgmental quickly. Yes, so you need to be aware and alert, conscious of your perception. So if we talk about a classroom as a teacher, if you see a person, if you see a student performing well in the class, do not make quick judgments. You need to, if you know that there's an objective criteria of determining the person's knowledge or the student's knowledge, and the objective criteria is through test, if this is what you think, go through that test, evaluate that test, keeping other things aside, keeping their previous characteristics aside, which is again not going to be easy. Let me tell you, that is the reason why these bias still exist. If handling or dealing with this bias was so simple and easy, we would have got rid of these bias and would not have been studying it right now, right? So in case of a performance appraisal, in case of a hiring process, you need to structure an interview beforehand. You need to document all aspects of the performance throughout the year. And these are some of the very basic ways. Dr. Priya says that in the hospitality industry, looks matter a lot, whereas in a banking industry, requirements are different. This is true. So again, whatever industry you are in, you need to have an objective criteria. If you think that in the hospitality industry, looks, etiquettes, manners, communication are the main things, go ahead, judge them, judge your employees on the basis of that, right? Then do not take other factors into account, how close they are to you, how close they are to the management. Do not take these things into account. In a banking industry, if you know that your knowledge, how you deal your customers, your past experience is something that matters, do not let your looks, your clothes affect your performance as a manager who's appraising the performance. Dr. Piyush, there's evaluating multiple times on different occasions, a very good method when you are evaluating, specifically when you're evaluating in a classroom, your students in an organization. You do not evaluate just once. And that is why when you study human resource management, you have multiple models of evaluation, right? You have 360-degree evaluation, you have multiple frequent evaluations. You evaluate on different occasions so that you have a full idea about what is going on with that person, and then decide on that basis. So this is what it is in your personal life as well. As an individual, when you are dealing with your personal life with your immediate family members, or as an individual who's working in an organization dealing with multiple individuals, managers, leaders, subordinates, superiors, anyone, these biases seem to creep in. And knowing about them, being aware about them, being aware about how you can deal with them is the best way to move forward. It's very unfortunate that we are not able to cover just 3 biases in this 2-hour lecture, but I would request Ishika to please move forward up the slides so these are more examples, marketing and celebrities, which I have given in the slide. In case of marketing as well, it is possible for us to fall prey to the horn effect or the halo effect. Marketers use this effect tremendously to their advantage to sell their products and services. Celebrities, when a celebrity spokesperson endorses a particular item, our positive evaluations of that particular individual can spread to our perceptions about the product. So the product may not be useful, but because we think that the celebrity is endorsing them and we have a positive attitude towards the celebrity, we think positively of that product. So again, some examples of halo and horn effect. Next slide, please. And we've discussed how to deal. We can move forward to the end of the slides, wherein we have some references. Last slide, Ishika, please. Yes. So there are 2 slides of references which consist of the major studies in the fields of biases that we have just now discussed. And this is all for this particular session. As I said, that we'll be sharing this particular PPT of this session by today. And we can take maybe 2 or 3 minutes for any questions that might be there. Yes, true, Dr. Vikram. They do not use the product, they just endorse them. And that is how marketers use this effect to our disadvantage and to their advantage. If there are any questions, please shoot them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself to ask the same. And thank you so much for such patient listening and being such a responsive audience. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, I just have one question from you.
Yes, sir.
Like you say that we all know that there's a halo effect that exists. So is halo effect always bad for us to, make judgments on, or is there some positive side to it? Because we know that it is there, whether we like it or not. So what would be your take on that?
Okay, so Dr. Ananda, in one of his interactions in this chat box, mentioned that he has been at the receiving end of the positive effect, that is the halo effect. So if you're at the receiving end, so let's assume, again, if you're a teacher in a classroom, if you perceive a student as someone who is good, who's positive, and that's why you evaluate them in a positive light, it is beneficial for them, it's advantageous for them. But as for you, as someone who is in that halo effect, who is lost in the positive characteristics, for you, this halo effect as well as the horn effect is restricting your rational decision making, because it is not allowing you to see things in totality. It is not allowing you, the halo effect is not allowing you to see the negative characteristics, or not allowing you to focus on them, and the horn effect is not allowing you to focus on the positive characteristics. So if your question is that is it always bad, or you can how can you convert it into a good thing? Yes, in most of the situations, again, I would not say that it is bad or good, but I would say that if you are under a halo effect or a horn effect, if you are under this bias, most probably it's going to restrict your judgments about other person, about your decision making, and how you perceive and how you make future decisions, whether it's about their grading, evaluation, performance appraisal, hiring, etc. So if you are letting that effect restrict your decision making and judgment, definitely it is going to be bad for you as far as future decision making is concerned. But if you're aware of them, if you know that this positive halo is there in my mind, but then at the same time you're like, okay, I know this halo is there, but then I remember I noted down somewhere that this person did a negative thing as well, and therefore this negative thing should be incorporated in the total evaluation, then you are in a way controlling the halo effect that is impacting you, controlling the impact of this halo effect. So halo effect is looking to the positives, but it impacts your decision making in a negative manner. So it looks like a positive term, but it's actually not in all sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll just scroll up to see if I think there were a few more questions. What could be the reasons or factors that lead to the halo effect? What are the main factors which lead to the halo effect? The main factor which lead to a halo effect is the first impression. So what our mind does is, again, our mind is very quick on making decisions. Our mind is very quick on jumping to judgments. So if I am interacting with you, right, and some of you just comes up and says, madam, you are so great, you just shower me with compliments that, madam, you are so great, you have been done such a good job, and whatever. And if I am evaluating you in your subsequent test, it's a possibility that your compliments, your good behavior towards me, your interaction in the session affects my thinking about others. And my predisposition is again one factor, right? What does my predisposition mean? My predisposition means that I'm a person who's inclined to taking positive feedback on the face of it, not realizing that whether that positive feedback is actually intentional or is it actually genuine, right? So if I have this predisposition that all positive feedback, I'll take it on the face of it, it's meant for me and it's, pushes me in the air, again, one of the main factors. And you can just reverse it for the horn effect.